Welcome to the Mining and Metallurgical Society of America webinar series. MMSA is an association of mineral resource professionals whose members represent all facets of mining and metallurgical interests, both domestic and internationally. If you are interested in becoming an MMSA member, be sure to check out our website, mmsa.net, for information on the application process. MMSA has always been a cohesive group of senior people from the mineral industry. The society is dedicated to increasing public awareness and understanding about mining and why mined minerals are essential to modern society and human well-being. The society concerns itself with fundamental principles and with problems facing the industry in areas such as legislation, economics and education, as well as environmental concerns, labor relations, and health and safety. Representatives from the Society from time to time testify before legislative bodies and provide advice to federal agencies. I am Kristen Guerin-Davy, MMSA member and the Social Media and Webinar Director. I'll be introducing today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is Regulation SK 1300, Emerging Trends in the SEC Review Feedback. Questions can be entered into the chat. The speaker will answer the questions after the presentation is completed. Please turn off your cameras unless you are asking a question. Dr. Kwame is the Union Pacific Rocky Mountain Energy Professor of Mining Engineering at Missouri University of Science and Technology. He is also the principal consultant at Sphinx Mining Systems. He served as the Mining Engineering Academic Fellow at the US Securities and Exchange Commission during the rulemaking process that led to Regulation SK 1300. In that time and the period immediately after, he led the technical aspects of the rulemaking process. He has taught over 300 industry professionals about SK 1300 and consulted for many mining firms on compliance issues with SK 1300. And with that, I'll hand it on over.
It is a pleasure. This is my second time presenting to MMSA on SK 1300, and it's always a pleasure. The work I'm presenting here is two different SME presentations or presentations at SME conferences. But when I was asked to do that, I thought this audience may, because I find that even SME members, a lot of people miss these presentations. So I'll go through them and then I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of it. I want to acknowledge Jude, who is my co-author for all this work. Jude is, you might notice the resemblance in the last name. So he's my nephew, but he's a mining engineer as well, and he helps me with consulting work. So he was part of this work. So I wanted to acknowledge him. So I'm going to present this as a two-part thing, but let me start with background. I'm sure everyone knows this background, but SK 1300 requires registrants who have material mining operations, is how the rule puts it, to provide summary disclosure unless you only have a single mine. There's an exemption for a company that owns one mine. But otherwise, if mining is material to your business, you're required to provide summary disclosure and internal controls disclosure. Those details are found in item 1303 and 1305. And then for registrants that have individual properties that are deemed to be material, they are supposed to provide the individual disclosure per item 1304. Some may not be aware, but the SEC reviews disclosure. They are mandated to provide reviews of disclosure on that's submitted or filed to them on a 3-year basis, although they have the right to not review a particular disclosure item, but they have a review program. And when I joined the commission to do this review, that I worked in the group that did the mining reviews at the time. And that group still exists and continues to do reviews of mining disclosure work today. Just a bit of background. So the rule became mandatory for the fiscal years that started on January 1 of 2021. Which meant that the filings for those companies that have their fiscal years coincide with the calendar years, those filings that were in early 2022 were the first batch of filings that were SK 1300 compliant, although there were some registrants that chose to disclose per SK 1300 even before that. The SEC then obviously start a review of those disclosures. And I have two projects, and the first one starts immediately after the rule goes into effect. And Jude and I started looking at trends in the comments and the letter exchanges between registrants and the SEC. So that's the first project that's in the first year of the review program under SK 1300, and we make comments on what we consider to be general trends in the program. So let's start with that. So our goal was to try and look through those comments letters, see if there are any trends in there, and then synthesize them and provide some detail. This particular project, the first project, there's actually an SME paper. So if you're an SME member and you go to onemind.org, you should be able to, or OneMind, you should be able to put the paper that goes along with it. The second project, we didn't write a paper with that, but I'll be happy to share the slides at the end of this presentation, so you don't have to feel a need to do screen capture or anything like that. So anyway, we did retrieve letters from EDGAR, which is the SEC's database. And then we analyzed that, some of it quantitatively because we're engineers and we like to plot histograms and things like that. And I'll show that in a minute. But a lot of it is qualitatively looking at the data and coming up with what we thought were trends that we were seeing in that first year of the review program. This is just our methods on how we retrieve the data. This is merely Joe doing the work. Just a shameless plug for my nephew. He's looking for grad school in the US. So if anyone, professors on the call, if you need a grad student, it's available. But anyway, so this is mainly Jude retrieving all the data. He ended up retrieving 42 letters in total. As you can see, 4 of the letters were related to Guide 7, so we discarded them since we were not interested in Guide 7. And then one was a Canadian company that was filing under the MJDS system. If you're not aware, the MJDS system allows reciprocity between US and Canadian filing. So if you're a Canadian company that meets certain requirements, you're allowed to use your Canadian filing in lieu of an American filing in the US, and American companies get the same treatment on the other side. So certain Canadian companies do not have to comply with SK 1300. They just have to submit their Canadian filing, the MJDS form, and it stands as valid disclosure in the US. So we analyzed the 36 letters, the 37 letters that actually fit into our scope. And this is sort of a breakdown of, so 25 of them were domestic companies, 17 were foreign companies. We can see the breakdown by SIC code within the SEC's use of the SIC codes. I know there are more SIC codes, but this is actually how the SEC classifies mining companies. The 7 companies were companies that provided SK 1300 disclosure, even though they were not actually classified within the SIC codes. There are companies that don't, you and I will not call them mining companies, but mining is material to the operations, and that's what SEC cares about. If mining is material to your company, even if you don't see yourself as a mining company, then SK 1300 is required. You can also see by market cap, and this trend, I would say, in looking at the data, even since we did this work, this trend is true, that the SEC is generally issuing more comments, in my opinion, for smaller cap, market cap companies. Now, the argument could also be made that there are fewer companies that have those lower market cap, and consequently, just by the natural process, there'll be more comments in that region. But you can see that breakdown here when we plotted the first year comments, the market cap here. Now, So there are three general observations or three general sections in this first project. First is make some comments on general disclosure comments, and then make some comments regarding the TRS, which is the technical report summary requirements, and then a few general observations later on. So let's start with the general disclosure. As you can see from this graph here, that shows the different sections of the law that were cited in the comments, you would see that, and in the three main sections of the law, 1303, 1304, and 1305, where 1303 is a summary disclosure, and 1304 is the um, individual property disclosure, and 1305 is the internal controls disclosure, and then the 601 is section 96, which is the TRS requirement. The point of this graph is to show you that they're using all aspects of the law to provide comments, and this is true today as we continue to look at the comments that come out. The other thing to note is that on the TRS, the SEC expects people to follow the TRS. And in the early days of SK 1300, there were some that thought they could use Canadian 43101 disclosure in lieu of the SK 1300 TRS. And we've seen from the SEC that they don't find that 43101 is indeed compliant with the SEC's TRS requirement. So this is an example, or this is a quote from a letter to District Metals Corp, where the SEC essentially says the point I just made, that using other mining from around the world do not meet SK 1300, and so ask this company to make a reference to their 43101 study from their filing. Similarly, in this, well, this is a follow-up quote. They say unless you are able to obtain and file a TRS from a QP that's defined under SK 1300, then you should remove any estimates of resources because they are not resources under SK 1300. So the first 2 points are that this SEC expects people to follow all of the rule and that other disclosures or other standards around the world, particularly 43101, do not meet the requirements of TRS under SK 1300. Now, this next point here about cash flows, that's actually the motivation for the second study. So in the second study, I'll talk a lot more about presentation of the TRS, but what we had observed in the first project when we looked at it was that the companies were presenting cash flows in different forms, and some of them the SEC was finding unacceptable. And so these are a couple of comments, one to Alliance Resources, and the other one to Freeport McMahon, essentially questioning the way they had presented their cash flows in the TRS. I will not make a lot of commentary on the cash flows because we did then the follow-on project, which is the second project in this presentation, that focuses entirely on cash flow presentation. So I'll just say here that in the first project, we noted that the SEC was questioning the ways in which some companies were presenting cash flows in the TRS. And then this was also an interesting one in 1302F. 1302F, which actually, let me go ahead and share what 1302F says. 1302F essentially says that QPs cannot do limited liability as you would do under NI 43101, for example. But then it says that for certain types of information that the QP relies on the registrant, in other words, the company, to provide that information, the QP can by specifying it in the TRS, the QP is not held liable, and the registrant is held liable for it. Especially when I teach classes, some QPs have a tendency to want to challenge this ruling or this interpretation of the law. And part of what caught my attention when I was reviewing this was the SEC was doing what I knew that the commission's intention was that this exemption is only for the things that are listed here. So in other words, just because there's the room for a QP to put the liability for certain information on the registrant, does not mean anything I choose to put the liability on the registrant, I can do that. And that, in fact, the SEC is interpreting the rule to mean the things that are listed on the slide, which is what you would find in 1302 F1, things like macroeconomic trends, marketing information, legal matters, so on and so forth. Those are the things that the SEC would allow a QP to say, I relied on information that was provided by the registrant to do so. So you can see, for example, in the sample comment letters that I have here, that these two letters say exactly the same thing. Especially this comment on the right side of the screen where the SEC writes, we know that some information listed under the heading, which is the heading that we're talking about, does not clearly fall within the categories of information or aspects of modifying factors for which such reliance is permissible under 1302 F1 of regulation scheme, which is what I was talking about. So the intention clearly in the regulation was that these are the things that they believe, because the standard here that the commission was going for, which is how we worked on the rule. Of course, the agency changes and the agency can change its interpretation. But when we were working on the rule, the understanding here was that the commission did not want to do limited liability as is done under 43101. And I could explain if people are interested why we arrived at that conclusion, but the lawyers explained that would be inconsistent with the general framework of US disclosure regimes. The only thing they wanted to do is for certain types of information that the registrant might be telling the QP what to do, then because those fall outside of the expertise of the QP, the registrant could provide the information. And again, even then, the QP is not liable only if the registrant is the one that provided the information. So if the QP, for example, went ahead and if the QP, for example, is a consultant and that consultant went ahead and hired another consultant to do that work, the QP is liable for the information. And this exemption or this loophole, so to speak, only exists if the registrant is the one providing the information, because then the registrant becomes liable for that information in the TRMs. And what we see here in these comments is the SEC enforcing the rule as intended. Okay, so a few quick fire things. The staff is clearly interpreting the rules for what they are. The rules mean what they say, and they expect people to follow the rules as they say. Materiality matters. The staff is looking for you to provide information both in the TRS and in the disclosure that are material. And that in fact, if you do not provide the information, the assumption is that you are making a claim that that information is not material. And of course, if it is material, then you're opening yourself up to lawsuits, class action lawsuit by investors for that. The staff expects registrants to provide the disclosures for all the things that are in SK 1300. So in other words, that summary disclosure, individual property disclosure if that's required, and internal controls disclosure. And then you cannot bring disclosure from other regimes like 43101. Again, caveat, this was a snapshot in time and the scenario evolves, and we've seen some of these things evolve. So that was the first project which we presented at SMA, I think in the spring of 2014, I think, 2024, sorry, no, 23. Okay, but, and the takeaways, I'm not going to dwell so much on these, but I think we've made my point. But the cash flow part caught our attention. And so we decided in the following year to do a project that was focused solely on cash flow presentation and look for comment letters around cash flow presentation and how the SEC was exchanging with companies around this issue of how cash flows are presented in the TRS. Okay, so this is again the same background that you've heard, except that it highlights section 19, which is where the economic analysis is supposed to be. And in section 19, the second bullet point says that in presenting the results of the economic analysis, which is what section 19 is about, QP should include annual cash flow forecast based on annual production schedule for the life of the project. There is actually a secondary comment here that I could talk about, but again, let me stay on track, right? About cash flow, but that has to do with how long can one do a discounted cash flow analysis for under this rule. But I'll stay focused. So the point of the second project was to look at comments relating to cash flow presentation, descent trends, and provide best practices. Again, we went into EDGAR, retrieved keywords, retrieved comment letters based on keyword searches till September of 2023. Again, we retrieved, I don't know why I keep getting this typo where retrieved is converted to retried, but retrieved 45 letters, both to the SEC and from the SEC. Once we found a letter, we kind of followed the chain of exchange till the issue was resolved. These are the companies that we reviewed letters to or from the SEC. And so you can see the list. They include some very large companies, well-known companies like BHP and Freeport-McMoRan, and it includes some smaller companies that we might not be as familiar with. Again, we categorized our observations into three broad categories. We were seeing issues being raised on presentations of cash flows that are not annual, going back to the text itself. Notice that the text says including annual cash flow forecast, and some companies were not presenting these cash flows in annual periods, and I'll talk about that. And then, so that drew some comments. And then there were companies that had presented the cash flows as graphs without any numeric values, and that drew comments. And then the last thing was there were some companies, for whatever reason, that did not have the cash flow presentation at all in the TRS. Okay, so let's deal with the first one. And Freeport is a very good example of the grouping presentation. So in the Freeport TRS, what you're seeing on the screen here, where cash flows are grouped into like 2022 to 2026 and then 2027 to 2031, was the nature of the presentation. That then drew this comment from the SEC saying revise your economic analysis to present the cash flow information on an annual basis, and then they asked for additional lines in the cash flow presentation as well. Freeport then responded, making the argument that they believe, so the second paragraph or third paragraph here is important, right? The company believes that providing annual estimates based on averages is a better representation than a specific year-by-year estimate because of inherent variability in the timing and amount of capital expenditures and annual mine plan sequencing over the life of long-lived reserves. As life of mine plans are refined periodically, the timing and amount of cash flows in specific annual periods are uncertain and can vary significantly year to year without material changes over multi-year time periods. The company has concluded that the net present values of the disclosed average annual cash flows are not materially different from the net present value of the annual cash flow estimates. In another part of their comment, they make the point that the purpose of the presented figures is to demonstrate the economic viability of the mineral reserves. Given the long-lived nature of the reserves, inherent variability in the timing of capital expenditures and annual mine planning processes, the annual cash flows may vary in subsequent disclosures. Freeport's approach, I highlight Freeport's approach because they argued successfully here that their grouping of the presentations is actually better for investors than presenting the annual cash flows. So the SEC allowed that to stand. And then you have Albemarle here, who had a similar presentation style. So notice over here, hopefully my mouse is clear. Let me see if I can do a pointer. Yes. Notice over here that they present this in an annual cash flow, and then they jump into grouping things. Again, it drew a comment that please note combining columns is acceptable. And this is the first time we see the SEC conceding that one might be able to combine columns. But they make the point that combining columns is only acceptable if the numerical values within the periods are similar and there's a statement regarding how you are doing the practice. This will become important later in how I think people should proceed going forward. The SEC is tipping its hat to say, okay, we concede that you might want to group them, but even if you group them, you have to provide a statement that explains how you are doing it and your justification for doing so. So that's on the grouping of the cash flows, and these are typical of the ones that we saw. When it comes to the annual cash flow presentations by graphs, BHP is a good example. So BHP did something like this in the TRS, where there were no numbers present, but a graph of the cash flows was provided. The SEC then issued this comment saying revise to include the annual cash flow based on annual production schedule as required by this, and it should include the entire discounted cash flow analysis. BHP responded, especially the second paragraph here where they say, we respectfully submit that consistent with the applicable requirement, the qualified persons have summarized the material information supporting the economic analysis that is presented. In particular, each CRS sets out the basis for the capital and operating costs, closure costs, royalties, and taxes that are reflected in the annual cash flow analysis, and in relevant part identifies the average unit cost and foreign exchange, so on and so forth. So BHP tried to argue back their position. So you see again here in another part of their letter, the annual cash flow presented in figure 19-2 reflect a number of inputs, including revenue, so on and so forth. And again, the figure they're pointing to is the graphical presentation of the cash flow that we are talking about. The SEC comes back saying, we note your response to comment 2 and we do not concur with your assessment. In order to meet the requirements, please revise to include the entire discounted cash flow analysis in each of your respective technical report summaries. So the SEC was not buying BHP's argument that they had presented the cash flow analysis with these graphs. And BHP ended up then paving and agreeing to do what the SEC wanted. So anyway, I'm not going to let you read, but the bottom line is BHP ends up with a similar grouping, much like the Freeport approach of the cash flows, but now providing numbers. And then the last group of companies are those companies that presented no cash flows at all in the TRS. So I have here two comments to two different companies. In both cases, the SEC saying we are unable to locate. Essentially, the cash flow analysis is not in the TRS, and you should provide the cash flow analysis, right? So in those cases, the cash flow analysis, they say, again, the SEC is essentially saying you need to provide a cash flow analysis, and it's not optional. Section 19, especially for a pre-feasibility study or feasibility study, is not optional. So you have to provide Section 19. So takeaways from that project, TRSs have to comply with SK 1300, and to be compliant, they need cash flows. We've seen that from those that didn't have cash flows getting comments to provide the cash flows. Presenting the cash flows in graphs alone will not be enough to become compliant. The SEC is looking for the numbers and the breakdown of the numbers. That was part of the argument with BHP. Um, and they're asking, the staff is asking for the details, including commodity prices and revenues. Essentially, you cannot just say the net cash flow is this number or provide a graph of the after tax cash flow like BHP did and say that's compliant. Now, this is the summary. My own understanding of the issue around the summary is that the SEC is now agreeing that, okay, you can't summarize and group, even though the rule says you should provide annual cash flow. It's okay to group them, but if you're going to group them, you're going to have to provide an explanation of how you are doing the grouping. So why is it that you're doing 2 years or 3 years grouping, right? And your justification could be like the revenue and costs are similar, so on and so forth, or that presenting the detail is not material information. Whatever your justification is, they expect you, if you're going to group, to provide an explanation for the process that you're using and some justification of why you're doing that. If you want to go with this grouping multiple years into one column style presentation that we saw Freeport argue successfully. Your justification is they expect you, if you're going to group, to provide an explanation for the process that you're using and some justification of why you're doing that. If you want to go with this grouping multiple years into one column style presentation that we saw Freeport argue successfully. So those are my initial prepared remarks. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, and I'll be happy to have a discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself or type them in the chat.
When it comes to cash flows, Kwame, the assumptions regarding forecast prices, forecast metal prices, commodity prices, we're seeing quite a lot of volatility in the market now. To the SEC, they abandon the 3-year trailing average price and they allow forecast price. Do you feel as if that there's going to be more scrutiny of the assumed prices supporting the cash flows by the SEC because of the current market conditions?
I don't have any particular insights about how the SEC feels about the current market conditions. I will say that I have seen comments asking for justification on pricing assumptions. And so I think as a general matter, one of the things the SEC did when they decided to move away from the 3-year average was to say now that the registrant gets to provide that price assumption, it is also up to the registrant to provide the justification for the price assumption, and that the price assumption has to be a reasonable price. So if the SEC finds the assumption not to be reasonable, they would question it, as they should, as part of their review process. But the justification, they tend to elicit the justification because they think it's important for the investor to be aware of management's justification for what they're doing. So in a separate conversation, for example, that I've had with them, I've had a conversation about the prices used for impairment testing and whether or not they expect that the impairment testing price should become closer to the price used in reserve analysis, for example. And they said, well, SK 1300 does not cover impairment testing, so they're not going to make any rules. But they expect to see that since management is the one coming up with both prices, if they diverge, they expect to see why the same management thinks that in one case the price ought to be so different from the other price. So I'm using that to support my point that they see themselves as eliciting these justifications for the pricing. And one, if the pricing is not reasonable, they have a responsibility to comment. And if the justification is not clear or is inconsistent to other contexts, in this case, the impairment testing, then they would want to know why. I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but that's the best answer here.
No, thanks for that. And thanks for the presentation. Very interesting.
Thanks, Gary.
If I can do a follow-up on what you just said there, if you have different price assumptions, does that require you to have an explanation why, for a particular year, you're using different metal prices in your cash flows or in your resource reserves for different projects or different mines in the same fiscal year end? Or is there an expectation it could be all the same, or at least you explain why different?
Yes, I would say, given the conversation about impairment testing, I would think that it would be good for you to be proactive in explaining why you have different prices for the same project over multiple years, or over multiple, different projects having different price assumptions for the same commodity.
Okay, thanks.
There are things that we need to be mindful of, that there are things that maybe the QP might have an influence, or the group of QPs that did a particular project might have an influence in the discussion. And then you put all of those things together in your disclosure, your 10K or 20F filing, and it also needs to make sense from the company standpoint. So if you're pulling information together from multiple TRS documents, the narrative also needs to make sense, and it is best practice for management to use their disclosure to explain to investors why the price assumption in that project might be different from the price assumption in that project.
Great. Are there other questions?
Mr. Sacker. Kwame, I want to know if you had seen the mineral executive order that President Trump issued last week. And there's a provision in there that references these regulations, and it's a little hard to understand, but it appears to be a move to potentially rescind some of these regulations. I'll just read it to you really quickly. It says, agencies that are empowered to make loans, loan guarantees, grants, equity investments, or to conclude offtake agreements to advance national security in securing vital mineral supply chains, both domestic and abroad, shall, to the extent permitted by law, take steps to rescind any policies that require an applicant to complete and submit to the agency as part of an application for such funds the disclosures that are required by Regulation S-K Part 1300.
Yeah, I saw that, and I read that. Yeah, I don't think that executive order is seeking to rescind SK 1300.
I couldn't. Yeah, can you explain it? What you think it's trying to achieve?
Yeah. So I will give you my best, since I didn't write it, but my understanding of what it seeks to do is that some of the programs, those loan programs that they are referring to, had actually been requiring, as part of the government's due diligence process, had been requiring companies to submit a TRS. And that's what this executive order is saying, that should not be a requirement to get these loan programs.
Okay, thanks for.
And the wording of the executive order has to do with, everything it says has to do with agencies that are giving loans or loan guarantees, which is not the role of the SEC. The SEC is doing this as part of its disclosure regime for the market. And so the executive order doesn't say anything. Now, would the administration later decide to rescind SK 1300? That's a possibility, but I don't think this executive order does that.
That makes a lot more sense. Thank you for that explanation.
Thanks for that question, Debbie. Greg, did you have another follow-up question?
Yeah, this is really meant to put Kwame on the spot. Do you feel as if there's a change in attitude towards the strictness of the compliance with SK 1300 over the years that it's been in place? And do you feel there will be changes going forward to how SEC enforcing specifics of the rule?
That's a good question. So up to this point, I don't think there's been much of a change. First off, they used to, on the very technical things, there used to be two reviewers, and Greg, you know this, Ken Schuler and John Coleman. And while they worked very hard to try and be consistent, it is not it is obvious when you review that there were small discrepancies between how the two individuals saw things. And now we only have John doing reviews. As far as I can tell, they haven't hired anyone else. And so you have a bit more consistency that way, I think. But I don't think the general tenor of the regime has changed. Now, my experience, even in the short period that I was in the commission, is that if you remember, I was in the commission when we started this work. It was under the Obama administration. And we ended this work actually under a Trump 1 appointed commission. And I can tell you that the tone of the rulemaking was very, very different. Where we were going and the instructions we were getting in the first, when we did the proposed rule, and the final rule was different because we had a change in administration. That's not to say they will change the rule. I'm just making the observation that having been working with the commission, that administrations and the emphasis, what they emphasize affects what the staff then do. The other thing too that I saw influence the way the staff address things is ever so often a registrant would elevate an issue to their bosses, which registrant can do, and often come into the building and have a meeting with higher management about how senior management about how the staff is interpreting a particular rule. And when that issue is resolved, a memo would be sent to all reviewers saying, on this issue, this is how you're supposed to deal with it going forward. So based on those experiences, it is possible once the commission is fully reconstituted again, and if SK 1300 is deemed to be problematic in some ways for mining companies, that even without changing the rule itself, certain aspects might become more relaxed for registrants. Obviously, that kind of change, if it's only done internally, can also flip back with a new administration. Whereas, a change in the rule itself would be more long lasting. But I can see that happening as opposed to maybe changing the rule entirely. Let's remember again, like I tell people, we actually did get the final rule under Trump administration. And there were certain things that, even though I would say generally once there were the elections and we had the Trump appointed commissioners, the tenor of the rulemaking was different. There were even then still things that the commission did not feel they would cross the line. One of them being limited liability disclaimer. Even the conservative commissioners didn't think they could allow that to happen. And the reason is that in the commission's mind, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not trying to say one thing is right or wrong, but in the commission's mind, in the US regulatory framework for disclosures, investors have to be able to sue someone if the information is materially false. And when you make disclosure, expert disclosure, which is what they see the TRS as, right? The QP is an expert, much like a lawyer writing a legal opinion or an accountant signing an audit report. That's expertise disclosure. So once you make certain disclosure, expertise disclosure, then the registrant is not liable. The expert is now liable for the disclosure. So then for the expert to then also say certain pieces of information in my expert disclosure, I am not liable for, will create a loophole where investors has no one to sue. And as I said, and that was, most of you wrote comments saying we need limited liability, much like they have in Canada. And even the Conservative Commission will not go there because they felt having a disclosure regime where if that disclaimed information happened to be wrong, investors could not sue anyone, would not be acceptable under the US regime. So some issues have already, I think, been litigated within a conservative friendly commission before. But again, it doesn't mean that it would not be revisited. These are just some thoughts myself on these issues.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for that.
Thanks for the questions, Greg. Is there anything else from anyone else? Did you have anything else to add, Kwame?
No, I mean, maybe final thoughts would be all of us have access to these comment letters. If you're writing TRS, I think it would be good to go, especially look at peer companies. You know, if you're in coal, look at coal letters, and if you're an aggregate company, look at aggregate letters. I know it can be daunting sometimes to track all of them, which I personally, that's why I use Jude to do the bulk of that work. He's good at finding the letters and then classifying them, and then I come in and review the big picture with him. But it is helpful for us to understand. Unfortunately, it is unlikely for us to see the SEC staff at SME or at conferences, much like the Canadian regulators do better. I think the Canadian regulators do better showing up at conferences, talking about trends. It is unlikely that we will see the SEC staff do that. Thus, these letters are the insights we have on how they view these issues. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at it yourself, and issues that are of interest to you, try to see what they are saying about that in other comments, and it helps you avoid those issues in your disclosure. But otherwise, stay tuned to. I know I do that. I know Greg does that. There are a few of us that do this, and so when we share this information out, pay attention so you can refine your understanding of these rules as we go forward.
Great. Many thanks for Dr. Kwame for his excellent presentation. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Our April webinar is confirmed for April 25th, 2025 on mining for nutrients, the evolving role of phosphates and potash, and let's not forget nitrogen. You will get a notice of our upcoming webinar as details are finalized. The webinars are generally scheduled for the third Friday of each month. All of our webinars are uploaded to YouTube and can be accessed through the MMSA.net website. The video of this webinar should be up within a week. The MMSA webinars are supported by the MMSA Jackling Foundation. We will post on our LinkedIn page when the video and slides are posted on our MMSA website. And again, if you are interested in becoming an MMSA member, be sure to check out our website at mmsa.net for information on the application process. The webinar is now ended. Thank you.